Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event. Inside the Cages, Jane Kurtin, the Staten Island Vans, break the Willowbrook story. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm an urban policy analyst and co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee at CSI. It is my honor to host this event, and I'm so pleased with the turnout of over 200 of you registered for tonight's event. Before we continue with our program, there are some housekeeping rules I would like to go over. Everyone will be muted during the event, except the speakers. After the panel discussion, we will answer as many questions as we can. Please put your questions in the Q&A throughout the evening so Professor Lavender can read them out in the question period at the end of the panelists to answer. There's also closed captioning available by clicking on the CC button on your screen. It is my honor to introduce Catherine Lavender, co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee. She's also director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, director of the Bartha Harris Women's Center, and an associate professor of history at the College of Staten Island. Please welcome Professor Catherine Lavender.
Thank you, Nora. And thank you to our attendees and our panelists tonight. This event is part of the Willowbrook Legacy Project's Year of Willowbrook programming. Tonight's event will feature a discussion among reporter Jane Kurtin, Staten Island Advance Executive Editor Brian Leyline, and Willowbrook Legacy Committee member Diane Biglioli. I have the honor of introducing my friend and colleague Diane, who will introduce the other panelists and facilitate the discussion. And then I'll be back at the end to help with questions, so get ready to put them into the Q&A box. Diane Biglioli is a key figure in preserving the Willowbrook legacy, from originating the idea of the Willowbrook Mile to helping create this whole year of programming as a member of our committee. We're so fortunate to have her as part of our efforts because she brings so many diverse talents to the work. She started her career as a staff member at Willowbrook, working with small children, an experience that launched her lifelong commitment to advocacy and activism for inclusion and dignity for all persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She's a former chair of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council and co-chair of the SIDDC's Willowbrook Legacy Committee. Many will recognize her as the creator and host of the CTV series Willowbrook Revisited, episodes of which are viewable on the Willowbrook YouTube channel. And she's co-founder and board member of A Very Special Place Incorporated. Thank you so much for facilitating tonight's discussion, Diane.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And of course, it's my pleasure. This is my passion. Having worked with young children at Willowbrook and having experienced the struggles that they had to just receive assistance from other people, when all that they truly needed was assistance, and that was exactly what was deprived from them, has been the focus of my life. And I've just been so fortunate that so many people have gone on to this journey now. And two of those people are the people here that I'm so, who I admire and I've gotten to know over the last number of years, Jane Kurtin and Brian Leyline. Jane is not the first person to lift the veil of what was happening at Willowbrook. Actually, Bobby Kennedy was in 1965, and there was one article in the New York Times. Nothing happened beyond that, except for a few things happened for Special Olympics because of the Kennedy family's involvement. But in 1971, Jane lifted that veil, and she and the photographer that accompanied her, Eric Arts, exposed Willowbrook and looked inside those cages for the first time. And Brian's role in this is so important because it wasn't just the lifting of the veil, it was that sustained focus and interest of the advance that has really truly brought us to this place where we are today, where the rights of people with disabilities was dramatically changed because of that exposure at Willowbrook. So I'm so pleased to be able to talk with them this evening and to share with the audience the texture of what was happening then. I mean, the whole concept here is remembering the past to protect the future. And so we really want to understand what it was that happened back then in 1971. And we have with us two people that were there. They were at the advance. Brian, at that time you were a reporter there as well. Was that your position then?
Oh, actually, Diane, I didn't start until about 8 months after the story broke.
Okay.
So I wasn't there when it broke, but I was a very young reporter watching what Jane had done. And it was probably one of the things that I was supposed to be a school teacher. And I was watching the difference that Jane Kurtin made really turned me into a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, as you see, I mean, some of the audiences knew, some of them have been following this story. Every time we talk about this story, we find out different pieces of it. Here's another impact, Jane's impact upon Brian Leyline, who only 3 weeks ago wrote one of the most powerful editorials that have been written about Willowbrook in terms of what event has changed Staten Island more than any other event, and certainly was Willowbrook. But let's go back to the beginning. There's so many things to cover here. Let's go right back to the beginning. Jane, you and I are around the same age. You're a young reporter at the Advance. How did this story come to you?
I had been a reporter. The Advance gave me a really terrific opportunity. I'm just saying that I started back in whenever it was, and I was kind of an amateur radical. So I think the first articles that they ever let me write were about the women's liberation movement. That's when they first started burning bras. That was the beginning. But that kind of established me probably as a low-level troublemaker. And I eventually wrote some stories about a civil service strike at the Public Health Service Hospital, CSW strike. And I got to know then Mike Wilkins and Bill Bronston, who were fulfilling part of their obligation for their medical degrees by working at public health. And if I get any of this wrong, it's been a long time. So, I mean, you know, and they and a social worker eventually moved to Willowbrook. And when they moved to Willowbrook, they contacted me and told me that there was something that I should see, that they thought that I would be able to write about it. And they had faith, I think, in my perspective on things. I certainly was not blasé back then. That's how I came to Willowbrook.
So it was Mike Wilkin and Bill Bronston, who also, it was Mike Wilkin's key that was given to Geraldo Rivera, and Geraldo Rivera went on the grounds to break that through the television media. But how did that first? So how did you get in there? How did you get in to write that story? So you have the information from Mike Wilkins and Bill Bronston. What did you do next?
They walked me through the front door. I mean, I was with people who were taking chances, but there had been no prior exposure. So there were no alarm bells. So it was just three people going through the front door, and they knew what they were doing, but the administration didn't know what they were, what was happening. And it was easy. I mean, it was just, we didn't have to jump over anything. We just walked through the front door.
Jane, how did Eric get the photos?
He walked through the front door with me.
I remember stories that he shot some through some windows also.
And through some windows. But there just wasn't that kind. Willowbrook had not gone into a defensive mode yet. There was not, they hadn't closed things down. It was, look, everything was going on in plain sight there. There was no reason for them to be nervous. We were just there. And we started looking and taking pictures.
It's interesting. There's no doubt about the fact that Geraldo Rivera played an enormous role in making all this happen. But it's interesting to look back to 1965, which I've done, to see what coverage you got. And Diane, as you mentioned, the Times did do one story. But the Advance covered that thing in 65, and there were multiple stories afterwards. I remember looking at one story where Jack Hammond, who was, I guess it was the director at the time,
Yes.
Right.
called an unprecedented press conference, I guess on the grounds of Willowbrook, and he blasted Kennedy, said he was a sensationalist, he exaggerated it. But the Advance was on top of that then, and it's unfortunate that it took 6 years for Jane to finally uncover the thing, when it could have been addressed in the mid 60s. But it's at the same time, in the 70s, Jane, we were going through an unprecedented time in America with Watergate exploding. So journalists were being taken much more seriously in the 70s, and were getting batted around at the same time by the Nixon administration.
Yeah. What was now you were there, you're saying that you were there, once the series had started. What was it like? What was the atmosphere like in the newsroom? This story was breaking, and it was pounding. I really suggest very strongly and recommend to people that go back, and we have him at the archives, each of the articles. It just belies Jane's age, because these were powerfully, beautifully written articles, just really textured. And I've read them many times. And what was the newsroom like? I mean, did the newspaper know what had just happened when they started to do this series?
I wasn't one of the editors at the time, but I don't think the newspaper really realized the impact that this was going to have. And I'm glad you talked about the way, Jane's writing style on this, because it wasn't just bold or courageous reporting. The writing style, Jane, it was magnificent, the writing. I think you told me you didn't really have journalism training, but it was incredible writing. And as Geraldo took you in visually, she took you in verbally through the descriptions of the seclusion areas and how, young people who could have been educated weren't, because they were shoved into these seclusion areas. It was just amazing. So
Yeah,
I think the mood in the room was an admiration for this type of writing.
Thank you. Yeah, can you see me blush? I mean, this is pretty fabulous. But
It was really, local journalism at the time, that kind of writing was sort of unheard of. You covered the potluck suppers and that kind of thing, but local journalism on Staten Island, this was really a really new chapter for local journalism on Staten Island.
Well, kudos to the Advance, to Les Troutman, to Richard Diamond, to all the guys at the city desk, to Bob Pop, who didn't try to take the emotion out of what I was writing. And there were other things that I wrote, and in that they toned me down. I remember them, going over adjectives with me and telling me some adjectives you couldn't use. But for this one, I was young and I was emotional, and they let it ride, and it worked. It resonated.
I've always thought you should have won a Pulitzer, but the deal is that there was such texture, and even Eric's work, and we will be later in this year, we'll be doing a showing of Eric's work as we get to the opening of the mile, which he has some of really the iconic photos that are used to explain the Willowbrook story. But just the positioning of, you did one article and it said, our children was just a higher font next to some pictures, and then you continue your story on an inside page, that these were our children, and that, it's how can society exist without a shared understanding of right and wrong, right? And you just put it there. It was so beautifully, plainly and simply said, these are our children, just through the pictures that you used, that you selected, and then the way you wrote your story, and the way everything, the thread through it was just fantastic. And the audience really should read these articles. Your experience, Jane, I had never worked with anyone with a disability before I went to Willowbrook. And that first day for me was very surreal and very, it was hard to process it. So when you walk in, you weren't fussing with anybody. No one was telling you you're not allowed here. Nobody was telling you go wait for the press person come to talk with you. So you just walked in. What was that experience like when you first saw all of this?
Completely overwhelming. So overwhelming that you really go into a kind of a different state, because you have to go into some kind of self-protective mode when you're looking at something you can't believe, you can't do anything about. It's incomprehensible. It's just incomprehensible. It was terrifying. You weren't afraid of getting hurt or anything like that, but it was terrifying that something like that existed, and existed right there in the middle of Staten Island in 1970 something. Mind you, this is only 50 years ago. We're not talking about the dark ages.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about 50 years ago. So we are still responsible. We're not talking about great grandparents and, ancient history. This is our world, our universe. This happened in our universe on our watch. It's mind-blowing, really. So tragic tragic beyond. It's very difficult because the people, especially in the first article that I wrote, the people were in such a state of actually, I would say, wildness, neglect. It was, you're looking at people who you've never seen a human look like this or behave like this. And you have other humans walking around, taking care of them. And you're a human looking at it. You don't know how to wrap your head around it. That was, was amazing.
Can you share with us? I know that you and Eric were close. Can you share, because he was the photographer that was with you. Did he share his feeling at that time? Unfortunately, we lost Eric this past year, but can you remember anything that you and Eric spoke about in terms, because he was photographing it now?
We really shared the same, kind of the same reaction. How is this possible? And it's also an incredible feeling of an enormous invasion of privacy, so that you're there recording something that you really think you should be averting your eyes. You should not be seeing it. You should not be recording it. It's too private. It's too horrible. And Eric was a very sensitive guy, and it's certainly reflected in the work that he did. But it was horrible for him. It was horrible for us.
Brian, when did you become more involved in the story? I know as editor, certainly, but during these earlier years, did you play any part with the development as the story continued? Because it certainly continued. It was sustained.
Yeah, not in the very early years, Diane, but I guess I don't even recall. It's been a long time ago, as Jane said, and the years blend together. I became an assignment editor, I guess, in the early 80s, and that's when I began making sure that we continued the coverage of this. I'm a firm Staten Island, they get to know how journalists work on Staten Island, and people, they've learned that if you keep your head down, you keep your mouth shut, they'll go away at some point. And I told our people, and not just this story, but a number of stories, we're not going to go away. And that's how you have an impact and make change. So I guess it was in the early 80s when I became city editor of the paper.
Right. Do you think when it first came out, because the Advents plays that role. I'm a Staten Island kid, read the Advents all my life, and watched my parents every night after dinner, read the paper. My mother would send whatever corrections she had in misspellings. If there was a misspelling, she would send it off to the Advents. But it was a part of our lives, right? And did the paper feel that they were presenting a local issue? Or did they know that this is a national issue? This is something else even beyond national borders.
Yeah, initially, we always saw it as a local issue. I mean, we're pounding in our head. If it doesn't happen on Staten Island, it didn't happen. So, so for us, it was always local, and I think that's important that it stayed that way. Because that really, we to this day, I don't know how. I was very close to Les Troutman and Dick Diamond, and Dick Diamond's philosophy, he taught me well, and he had very simple philosophies in life and about journalism. And one of them was just do the right thing. And you know what the right thing is. You always know what the right thing is in your gut. You don't always do it. And the right thing was to cover this story and make sure it didn't go away. So, it's always local for us. How does it affect locally? But we obviously saw this thing burgeoning, through the Willowbrook consent decree and how it was spreading across America. But for us, it was always Willowbrook on Victory Boulevard.
Yeah. I'm wondering, was there, reading the articles, it hit one focus area after another. The legislation, one group blaming Albany, another group blaming the doctors blaming the finance people. It went back and forth, and Jane, you were hitting on every one of those notes. How did that play out? Was it that information was coming into you or that you would continue to investigate something? How did you cover so many facets of this story?
I was not, there was a certain moment in what we were doing in that there was a funding crisis in Albany.
Yes.
And there was, I really don't remember the exact details, but at that point, at one point, now this is how young I was. I was so young that I thought I could call Albany and tell them that there was a problem at Willowbrook. And I actually did that. I actually did try. And I called television stations as well, because I was trying at that point to do something. I mean, we were writing the articles, but when we're talking about the impact of what you've seen and the responsibility that you feel as a human, as a person, to do something, just to do something, to do anything. I was calling, and as I was calling, I was learning. People were responding. I mean, it's hard to imagine now that you could actually call and somebody actually answered a phone. But there was a time when you did get people on the phone. You got, executive assistants who gave someone some information, who called you back, and little by little, you got some information. It was accidental. It wasn't. I didn't know what I was doing. I was putting one foot in front of the other. I was talking to people, and every step I took gave me another piece of information that I used to take the next step.
See, this is what I find so interesting about this, though, Diane, that, there were journalists who think that you report a story, it's the facts, just the facts, and then walk away from it, and then report the next story, and wait until something happens and report the next story.
Right.
I have absolutely no journalistic training through colleges or grad school. I learned just by doing.
Right.
My philosophy has been, I'm in this to make a difference. The advance is in this to make a difference. That's what she did. So, and this is the first time I've heard this, but by picking up a phone and wanting to say, we got a problem here, that's really advocacy journalism. And that's what community journalism should be all about.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you concerned about there being an absence of local newspapers, because the Times did not proceed with it. The Advance saw it as a local story about something happening here, and they continued and they sustained, and they write that story with that perspective. And the loss of local papers is a concerning one, wouldn't you think, Brian?
I think it's an enormous problem. It's a whole nother webinar we could do. I think that eventually America will be in real trouble if there aren't independent local journalists. Social media is really out of control in a lot of ways. I mean, just simply on Staten Island, trying to cover Staten Island politics is so different from Jane's time or my time, most of my time growing up and into the 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s. I mean, today, local politicians, we follow Twitter rather than following the politicians.
Right.
Because they want to put their own spin and not answer for it.
Yeah.
And it's not good. I mean, I'm not saying for a moment that every single journalist is God's gift to America.
Yeah.
But at least you have somebody questioning face to face.
Yeah, I mean,
when Bill de Blasio was mayor, I can't tell you how many times I would read every single morning, Bill de Blasio was having a press conference. At the end of every single description of what the press conference was going to be about, 95% of the time said, there will be no questions.
Right. Yeah. What happened in 1971 would have a very difficult time happening today. Right? This type of article coming out, this type of information being shared the way it was shared then would have some difficulties today. And it makes me wonder, to just go to the next place, was there pushback at the time? Was there some pushback at the Advance when this was happening? Be it politically, from the community? Was there a pushback? Albany? The administration?
Not that I was aware of.
That's a good question, though. Because I can tell you that, again, because we are local, I shop at the same supermarkets, I go to the same restaurants as people in this community who are players in the community. I cannot tell you how many telephone calls I get from leaders in this community who we are about to do a story on, calling me, trying to either put a spin on the story or stop the story. It's a very difficult life to lead at times.
I would imagine so.
I am guessing that there were phone calls made to Dick Diamond and to Les Troutman. And as Jane said before, it's a testament to those two people that this went on, that this story saw the light of day on Staten Island.
I mean, when we did the interview back a couple of years ago, we talked a little bit more at length about Les Troutman and Richard Diamond. And maybe, Brian, maybe you want to, right here, just talk a little bit about that, about their commitment as the publisher and as the editor at the time, that they went behind the story, and they I'm sure they had to get, I know at the time, Dr. Hammond, I knew there were things that they would come out and say, what was written was not true, but of course it was. So there had to be the calls coming in. There had to be letters coming in. And they stood up and said, we're continuing the story, because this story didn't stop from the moment. I mean, the first 17 articles ran between November and of Jane's articles between November and December into February of 72. But it continued the whole time. And the Advance stood with that whole, when the deinstitutionalization started from when Willowbrook was closing, and all of the group home issues that came up right in the neighborhood. The Advance stayed very strong. They stayed right next to Betty Connolly on that whole issue as we were making that move. So the Advance has been, through Les Troutman, Richard Diamond, and of course yourself, Brian, they've been really stalwart in this. I'm so proud of our paper and for the positions that they took. But can you share with us a little bit about Les and Les Troutman and Richard?
Boy, well, there's so many stories I tell about Les. I can't tell you. Les was a very tough editor, but he was fair. Dick died, I guess, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Dick was a very special person. When you talk about publishers, you think it's all about the bottom line, and I'm sure Dick was concerned about the bottom line. But this was his family. This paper. His uncle, S.I. Newhouse, took over the paper in the 1929, and Dick was his nephew. And Dick, S.I. was always the publisher of the paper, but Dick was the associate publisher. But Dick was the hands-on guy every day, and he loved this community. And I assure you that he was behind Jane in this thing. I mean, I never had the opportunity to speak to him about it. But he again, it was always do the right thing. That's what he believed. Yeah. And that's what he taught me. And I can't tell you how many times I would go to him. Newhouse was a very unusual organization, and then Les never had a budget. I only started having a budget maybe 8 or 10 years ago, not even. So we didn't have a budget. We just spent money. So, and what they call going up, if you have to add pages to the paper to accommodate a story like Jane's, it costs a lot of money to go up. Newsprint is expensive. Dick's position was always, if you can justify it to me, do it. And that's how we ran the place. And that's what he taught us, to do it as we own the paper. Every single one of us felt an ownership because we became part of the family. We became part of the Newhouse family and the Diamond family. And it's that way today because Dick's daughter is now our publisher.
Right. It's very evident. Jane, tell us a little bit about what was your relationship then with Les Troutman and with Richard Diamond. You're this young woman writing these really powerful articles. What was that conversation between the two of you? What was, obviously they were supporting it, but what were they saying to you during this time as you're writing this? You're getting front pages all the time. You're getting front page headlines, one article after the other.
Well, they were great, but I was scared of them. I mean, they were supportive. They were just absolutely supportive. You know, Richard, Mr. Diamond, was a risk taker. I mean, he really would tell you to go with it, go with it. I mean, he was not a really, in my experience, was a limited experience. There's an old perspective. As Brian was saying, if you were doing the right thing, if you were doing a good thing, if you were committed to it, he was ready to let you go with it, take a chance with it. Les was supportive, and just, they didn't get in the way. They let me do it. That was the best thing that they could have done. And we didn't know at the beginning that it was going to take off. And they didn't restrict me. They didn't modify me. So they were supportive. They were wonderful.
You mentioned somebody else, Jane, Bob Pop. Bob Pop was a great city editor.
Oh,
and a very gentle guy. But there was an editor at night, Diane, his name was Al Pearsall. I don't know if you remember him.
Oh, yes.
No, Pearsall. I remember the name.
This guy was out of Central Casting as a grizzled news guy with the sort of yellowed white shirt on, sleeves rolled up. And at midnight, and because I used to work nights a lot, at midnight, invariably, he would go to the refrigerator, get a quart of Pabst Blue Ribbon, come back and plant it on his desk. Then at 2 or 3 o'clock when we get off, we would go to the Buddy Club of the Roadhouse. But those guys were real journalists. They were real hard-nosed journalists who didn't care what waves they made as long as those waves made a difference.
Yeah. And what a difference it made, right? Because of you, because of the two of you and the advance. I mean, 1972, Public Law 94-142 comes out, which says that all children are entitled to education, children with special needs. 1980 comes out, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized People Act. 1990 is the American Disabilities Act. And all this, we can thread it back to Willowbrook being ground zero. So there's no doubt the impact that these articles had, not to mention to light the fire under the television media to come in and really give the audience, the visual and sounds. I think when you ask Geraldo, what does he remember? And he'll talk about the smell of Willowbrook, and he'll talk about the sounds. And when I talked, you remember we did the interviews with some of the parents who had their children living there, hoping for more opportunities for children, and the state failing terribly. They talked about the sound, the din that existed in there. You were catalytic in all of this. Do you know that? Do you feel that? Is it something that is part of your persona now? Do you know that you've accomplished this?
You talking to me?
I'm talking to both of you. Yeah.
Well, I've never seen it as an individual thing, Diane. I guess, again, Dick always pounded this into me too. It's not us, it's the newspaper that did it. And that's true. If we didn't have this platform, Jane and I couldn't have done this individually. And the other thing I just want to make mention of, and I will admit that I will admit an annoyance with Geraldo Rivera early on.
Yeah.
When we saw this story play on Staten Island, and it was a big deal in Staten Island, but all of a sudden it goes national. It took me a little while to accept the fact that this was a partnership. I never really spoke to Geraldo about this, but I learned a lesson through them about what a partnership print and visual media can be. Yeah. So I used to go to great lengths to partner with New York One a lot, in an effort to really make that impact that we want to make, because I recognize the fact of the power clearly of visual journalism. I mean, I'd be foolish to try to deny that.
Yeah. Yeah. Jane, I mean, do you have a sense of the impact? And I agree with you, Brian, 100%. No one person truly is really responsible for everything. We all, but we bring pieces to it. And I really think that those of you who have taken such heroic action, which I consider an advocacy, I hope that you feel it inside, that you know that you are part of what made the change. And I'm asking you, do you feel part of that change? Do you know that you made this impact?
Diane, I have a grandson who is, the best grandson in the universe. And but one of the things that we do together is we build a fire. And my thing with him is, I always say, Kai, we're going to put all the sticks, and our challenge is to get the fire going with one match, which is a challenge. You have to prepare for it. You have to lay it out. And we do. We've gotten it. We've managed to set it up. So in a way, when you talk about Willowbrook, it was one match, and we got a fire going, and it went on from there. I didn't know it was going to go, but it went. And you and I spoke earlier a little bit, and about, and I mentioned to you that my parents were survivors, Holocaust survivors, but one of the most extraordinary messages from my mother in life always was that you don't take no for an answer, you don't give up. So I certainly wasn't bringing that as a direct connection from my parents to Willowbrook, but part of that, and part of, I guess, the Jewish tikkun olam, which is change the universe, do something that changes the world, somehow that must all come into something. You can't really do that much, but if you can start the fire with one match, there's a possibility that things happen. So I feel good about it. I said it's my gold star.
Yeah.
I'm proud.
And Willie should be, as should Brian. Brian, you just wrote this editorial, and I know that I'm reading the questions that are coming up, and I know that Catherine's already put it in the chat, the entire editorial that you wrote recently. But I thought maybe you might want to reflect on that in tonight's webinar, in terms of the importance of Willowbrook, the event of Willowbrook here on Staten Island.
Yeah,
Is there any other event like that?
Yeah, you asked if we realize the impact of what Jane had done, and then the newspaper over the course of the decades. And I guess I don't, because you do so much every day. You get lost in the shuffle of every day. So Diane and I had lunch about the Willowbrook Mile a while back, and there's a gentleman named Caesar Claro, who's the director of the Richmond County Savings Foundation. And Caesar loves to just throw these questions out to get conversations going. So he posed it. He said, what two events on Staten Island could, made such an impact? And Diane and I looked at each other, and, we threw some things out, but it was that maybe at that point in 2022, that I recognized that this has got to be the most significant events that changed, that has come out of this community, that has changed the course of so many different lives in America. And a friend of mine the next week agreed with me, but also talked about a gay man who was murdered on the South Shore, who also, effectively changed the bias laws in America, or at least New York State.
Right.
But this Willowbrook story, and it struck me, and I was thinking, what am I going to write about this week? I was thinking about this Sunday night, I began to panic, and it struck me that this needs to be told, that Staten Island was like ground zero for the change for the way people with special needs are treated in America. And that, Jane, should always stay with the both of us, that we made Staten Island count.
Yeah. I know for me, I have certain isolated moments for me that stay with me in my life as a person. And some of them happened to me at Willowbrook. And I'm wondering if there's something, Jane, was there one, if you had one thing that stays with you, is there one thing that stays with you about your experience at Willowbrook during the writing of these articles?
The kids crawling on the floors that were not kids. And I would say that that's a visual that you don't get rid of. Young adults, you know, naked, crawling.
As you said, the one person looking at another person saying, there shouldn't be a person that should be presented to me in this manner. This person should not, you should not see this. Yeah.
You know, to fast forward to like now, to see how young people like this, through your agency, Diane, through Very Special Place, On Your Mark, Lifestyles for the Disabled, you know, how wonderful life can be for people with these kind of special needs. And it really struck me. I'll just tell you a very quick story. There's a young woman, she's the sister-in-law of a gentleman I work with, and she's a huge Frankie Valli fan. She has Down syndrome. So Frankie Valli was appearing in the St. George Theater. I'm chairman of the board of the St. George Theater. So he came to me and said, you think you can get her a decent seat? So we put her in the front row. Now she's been a Frankie Valli fan for all her life. Frankie Valli noticed her in the front row, and he came down and he sang to her. This would have never happened if this story wasn't broken in 1971. She
never would have been in a theater.
No. So it's things like that that just make me remember, you know, the power of all this.
Absolutely. I mean, and worldwide, not even just that it's a national thing. You know, that little match, you know, really set the world on fire in terms of it really brought the story out to you know, across international bounds. And it's why the Willowbrook Mile, which both of you are well aware of, we'll be doing that opening September 17th, and hopefully you'll be there with us, is that it remembering the past to protect the future. You know, Willowbrook never again. And I think the only way we can really deal with the present is that we infuse it with our lessons from history. And that's why it's so important for you to be with us this evening, to really, you know, it came together because people were thinking and people were sharing information and people were working and focused. And this is how this happens. It doesn't happen with people saying somebody else will take care of it. Maybe it's not so important, but focusing and putting energy into it, taking action and having the support, Les Troutman, Richard Diamond, having the support of people say, go ahead and do it. This is a story. Like you said, very simply, Brian, do the right thing. It's the right thing.
You know, the Willowbrook Mile, I think, is so critical. And I have great difficulty understanding or accepting the movement in New York, particularly of ridding New York of all the monuments of people, historical figures who perhaps didn't do the right thing. Mm-hmm. Got to be a different way to deal with that. But I can tell you for sure that on the College of Staten Island campus, at some point, there was leadership who did not want to do the right thing and did not want to recognize the legacy of Willowbrook. Because if you do not shine a light on these things, people, believe me, in the field of journalism, people quickly forget. And the Willowbrook Mile will not allow people to forget that this can never happen again, because it can.
Oh, it can. If you look right now at some of the trends that were happening back at the time of Willowbrook, the underfunding, the lack of staff, the confusion of loss of identity of the department that was responsible for overseeing the right thing to be done. Some of those things are muddy right now, and we're concerned if it's sliding backwards. So it's very, very important. The Willowbrook Mile is very, very important for us to sustain this.
In other aspects of our life here on Staten Island, it's happening with the homeless. There's a 200 to 300 person homeless shelter being built in Tompkinsville. It's starting to border on warehousing.
Yeah.
And that's not the way it's supposed to be.
And this is a lesson learned from the past. It was a lesson learned from the past that was paid for not only in wasted dollars being spent, but in lives being wasted. And we can't move in that direction. We know warehousing doesn't work. We know it causes all other types of difficulties. People react to it because they just think it's the community objecting to large groups of people being in their neighborhood. That may be true for some people, but just on a conceptual basis, warehouse doesn't work. It doesn't work. It causes other problems.
I've done a ton of work with Terry Troy and Project Hospitality.
Yeah.
And when 2 or 3 families go into a neighborhood, people don't even know it. And generally, those homes are the most well kept.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They want to be a positive force in the community. They want to prove themselves.
Right. It's quite the same. It's a real good parallel, Brian, to when the group homes first started opening for people with disabilities, right? Not here, not in this neighborhood. And yet, once those homes were established, they were wonderful neighbors.
Right.
And probably enriched that neighborhood. And what I always used to say at community board meetings, one of the people that's moving into my house already lives 3 blocks from you. His whole family is there. He's moving away from his family now into a group home. This guy's lived in your neighborhood the entire time.
Yeah.
So some of it is about educational, it's an educational goal to get people to understand. And who plays a part in that, of course, is the newspaper, is journalism. Is really focus and point that out to people, right?
Well, at one point in coverage of the group homes, I outlawed the phrase group homes because it became such a flashpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to mention 2 of the families that I worked with. It was Murray and Vicky Schneps and Malachi and Diana McCourt.
Yeah.
Now, these were families, and part of what was going on at the advance then, which was you called the advance, the switchboard answered, you asked for the city desk or you asked for the reporter, and there was a direct line right in, conversation, open. And those people, when they had been obviously representing their children, their family members that were there, but it really, because of the advance and the open door, it really became such a team effort once it started to go. There were people that were there for it, locked in, supportive of us, and we were supportive of them, the collective them. But we had these terrific organizers that were there to, point you in the direction of what they were going to do, what was going to be said. They were making they were educating the public on the different degrees of disability. It wasn't, retardation was just the big blanket word, and it was, everything was in there, everything. Such ignorance about it. But they were fabulous, and the relationship with the advance really empowered them. It was very symbiotic.
Yeah, Malik, excuse me, Murray unfortunately passed a few years back. Vicky is she's still on the hunt. She runs several newspapers and radio stations in Brooklyn, Queens, and part of the Work WRC organization that runs many group residences. And Malachi and Diana are still very much advocates and continue to do so. Malachi tells the story of that they blocked Victory Boulevard, and I'd love to go through and see if there's he recalls a picture that they had at the advance. They blocked off Victory Boulevard. The parents out there they wanted to close it, and he said, we're onto the streets, and he's just a wonderful character, Malachi. And so that's somewhere in the archives. I have to try and find that. They talk about it, and they talk about it with great warm feelings towards the advance. They felt supported here in the island. they're just powerful, powerful, intelligent advocates. Murray Schnaps is just, I came to meet Murray, and then I did a couple of interviews with him. What a fireball he was. He just, it's that grouping of people. It was like, how could this thing, Murray once said, how could it go wrong? By the time we had this group, we were such a wave. We had such a group of people and such a passion and dedication. These were their kids. And Willa Mae Goodman and that whole group and the whole story of Gouverneur, which will be our next show and in our next webinar in June. Just powerful, one powerful story upon the other. And, good people get together and it starts to happen. That momentum starts to gather. But what a group of people, what powerful, interesting, textured people, yourselves included. I mean, it is something. It is something for us to learn from. It's something for us to be able to continue into present time. As Brian said, let's talk about present time. Let's bring it now. We have some of the same situations. So how do we gain, group forces again with the advance, with the advocates to say, we have to be mindful. We already went through this in 1971. We don't want to go through this again. We've learned this lesson, and let's do the right thing. Simply said, Les Troutman, let's do the right thing, and we do need to do that. I would like to also say, we brought up the Willowbrook Mile, that there is a bench there with Jane Curtin's name on it at the expose station. There are benches along the mile that commemorate people and honor them. And one is there for Jane Curtin from the Advance, acknowledging her efforts and those powerful stories that she wrote. And really, I said, remove that veil, open that up for us to see it.
Thank you.
So what do you think is the way to ensure that, Brian? What is the way to once again use the power of this local media, get ourselves a young Jane Curtin, or make Jane Curtin return to because she's still a powerful person with wonderful skills. How do we continue this going forward? What are your recommendations, the two of you?
Well, I think I think that we have we have a lot of good journalists on our staff. The issue today is what people want to read, frankly, and the passion of the community itself. I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't think Staten Island has the passion that it had 15 years ago, let alone in the 1970s. So, and again, the political leadership back then was, people like Betty Conley and Eric Vitaliano. They were really strong leaders. With the social media and the way people react to news these days, I don't know if we could garner that same kind of support, because again, stories hit, they make an impact, and then they go away. Because I probably have a third of the reporting staff that I had 25 years ago.
Yeah.
The newspaper industry, again, to go back to the beginning of this discussion, is not what it was. You would be stunned. Every morning I get a report as to what people are reading. There are a lot of mornings, and I am not exaggerating, where people are more interested in Dear Abby than a homicide 2 miles from their house.
Yeah. Jane, you have thoughts on that?
Well, this is it. This is what it is. Bringing it down to being small and local. When we said our children, our neighborhood, I mean, there is some way, the parallel between group homes and bringing, dismantling an institution. So there's kind of an emotional dismantling that has to go on, and bringing things back down to a perspective of our town, our neighborhood, our lives, as though we really do have some control. I don't know how you get the feeling of control back, because on so many levels, we're so saturated and everything seems so out of control. But I think that's the role of the of the Advance and the other local papers, is to stick with it until the focus comes back to your own backyard, because it's great to be global, but as a second step, the first step is your neighborhood, your neighbors, your homes, your institutions, your families, and that's where the Advance and other papers like it will, I think, eventually get it back to where it's supposed to be, where you can pick up the phone and somebody will answer.
Yeah, I guess, we've been affected by social media to that degree that everyone's attention span is so much less. They can get a text message and that is all the news they need about something sometimes, instead of sitting there and reading an article that, there's texture to it, and there's something is being processed, the thought process is in there, and it's being intertwined with not only the facts, but the impressions of the journalist, and it's giving you something. People, maybe they want something quick. They want something quick, and then they're going to move on to the next thing. I think all of our attention spans have gotten much shorter. I think the pandemic has taken its effect on us as well. But, I think that we need to be able to proceed with any movement. We need to garner support and find a foundation that we all agree on so that we can proceed. And I think we have to light a match. It's time to light a new match. And
when I talk to reporters, particularly reporters just starting out, when you look at a story and you're going to report on a story, one of the things you got to keep in mind is, what does it mean to me? So that's what you got to tell the readers, what it means to them, because today everything is about me. So, the most passion we've seen on Staten Island in a long time was about wearing masks. Now, the issue for me is not whether you want to wear a mask or whether you don't. It's the way the anti-mask people presented it. Vulgarity, screaming, blocking streets, protesting in front of school because the city of New York set up a vaccine site for parents who wanted to get their kids vaccinated, totally voluntary, trying to scream in the kids going in. I mean, it's very difficult to cover this community at times.
Yeah, I understand that, living in this community. So I want to say that I look towards the two of you, that we keep the fire moving, we keep the fire growing. I've learned so much from the two of you, and thank you again for doing this and spending this time with us. But I want to be able to open it up to some questions from the audience, because I see the scroll to the right of me, and there's been a lot of them being asked, and I want to give them a chance to have some of them answered by the two of you. So, Catherine, I know that you're the keeper of the scroll.
Right, I am the keeper of the scroll. Thank you. Well, that was really great, and it's true. We always learn something new every time we start talking about this, things that I had never heard before. I just know that when I read Jane Curtin's article, the Inside the Cages, and then the other coverage, as an historian who's read a lot of newspaper articles over her, long career, I was so impressed by the empathy, by the way in which you made the people you were writing about, not them, but us. That was really powerful. And I have wanted to honor you and to make sure that people knew about the role that you played in the story for a very long time. And I'm so happy that we finally had the opportunity. I mean, I know you did get the honorary doctorate at the college, but that's not enough. I want you to have the Pulitzer. I want a Pulitzer for you. I don't know how to make it happen. I'm going to work on it. We'll see. So I had a question, but I think Jane sort of incorporated it into the conversation, and it was about the power of local media. And I really sincerely in my heart believe that if we had not had the Staten Island Advance, this story may never have come out. And certainly for people who now are trying to understand the history of it, we wouldn't have had those very vivid accounts from inside that you and that Eric Ayers were able to capture, both in your language and in his visuals, amazing photographs that he took. So thank you so much for that. So there are a lot of questions. A couple came in the chat, so I'm going to ask them first, and then we'll go to the Q&A questions. But two that came in the chat from Cheyenne Richardson. Cheyenne asked, could you tell us about, Diane had asked about the atmosphere of the newsroom. What was the atmosphere of Staten Island like when that story broke? Can you recreate that for us a little bit?
Oh,
I mean, did people talk about Willowbrook who weren't connected to Willowbrook, or was it just a kind of secret that many people didn't know what it is?
you know, it's an interesting question, because whether or not, and I've referred to this very often as, you know, in plain sight, it was not a secret. It was not a secret. I walked through the door, people knew about it. It was just kind of one of those things, you know, when I was a kid, there was, for instance, a family in the neighborhood where the father beat the kids. And you didn't call the police back then. You kind of, what it was, well, that's the way it is over there. So on a horrific scale, Willowbrook was, well, that's the way it is over there.
Yeah, that's so true, Jane. Because the same feeling was surrounded Mount Loretto, which was a home for orphans, people thought. Well, it was a home for court referrals for a long time, and it was a horror show over there. And people said, well, that's the way it is. And that is one of the things about Staten Island. You know, we still call ourselves the Forgotten Borough. I mean, it's the way it is. You know, and it took a guy like Guy Molinari to stand up and start screaming when he became borough president, and a mayor like Giuliani who took notice. The only reason because Staten Island elected the guy. But yeah, and that's what I mean today. It's sometimes hard to generate that kind of passion, and that's why I think it's so important for journalists to try to make a change and not just report the news and move on. You know, I used to tell people, I know you didn't elect me. I know you didn't choose me to be the editor of the paper to try to make these changes. And if you don't like me, stop buying the paper. I mean, that's the only way you can not elect me anymore.
Yeah.
That's right.
You know,
Another question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just like the concept, Jane, of saying in plain sight, because if you remember, the 117 bus ran through Willowbrook every single day. Every 25, 30 minutes, a 117 would go through.
And how many people do we know worked there? You know, did Diane, or were phone operators, or
yeah, probably around 1,500 people, most of them from Staten Island, some from Jersey. Probably that's the demographics there.
Yeah, so the roots, you know, really spread out across Staten Island.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really seems to me everybody had some connection. Every family in some way was connected to that story. And I think many families clung to that hopeful fiction that everything was great.
Yeah.
That it really was what it had hoped to be, you know, that ideal place, the best place for their family members to be.
Well, but you know, in the you know, the timing is everything cliche. Timing is everything, because when you went and you saw, if you took the chance of actually looking at Willowbrook. Now, I didn't know what I was going to see when I got there. And once I got there, it was too late to say I didn't see it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to take a look at it, the next question would be, and what are you going to do about it? So, you know, for me, it was, you know, relatively easy. I could go back and I could write about it. But for the rest of the world, and not to absolve anybody of anything, but once you looked at it, what were you going to do about it? Mind-boggling, astonishing, not to untie there.
Yeah.
So with the newspaper and the moment and the families, it just, I think, forced people to see it. And then there was a collective, well, I guess we have to do something about it.
Yeah. I mean, the word that often comes to mind when I think about the families is agony. You know, it's intense pain, but it's ongoing, wrenching. And what are the alternatives available? And it's been so moving to learn from family members, survivors of that whole family experience of a person being sent, the loss of siblings, that sort of thing. It's been really amazing to hear the stories of the families. So exactly what you're talking about. And I don't even know how they would begin. Aside from the activism, I don't know what else was available to many of those families for them to do. And that the agony of not being able to address it must have been intense.
You know that they were encouraged to drop their children off and forget them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there were very little accommodations made for people to visit. It was on Wednesdays and Sundays. I mean, that basically was it for a number of hours. And usually the parents weren't allowed into the building. They would bring the son or daughter to the main area, and then the parents had to take them out if they had just traveled from the Bronx for 2.5 hours, you know.
Yeah.
And I just want to, I just remember this one other thing, because there was the simple, not simple, but toilet training. Toilet training was a monumentally important thing. It meant the difference between parents being able to take a kid home or not take them home. So there was, I remember now, somebody explaining to me that if they were able with certain levels of the population to give them the time for just toilet training, it would have meant the ability to visit with their families. And it didn't happen. It was not possible to happen. But something so fundamental that could have meant so much, and it couldn't happen.
Boy.
Yeah.
Well, James Edmondson asks, I mean, we're talking about the power of your reporting here. Why would editors tell you to tone down your adjectives? I mean, it's a different time, right? And there's a journalistic style, but could you talk a bit about that?
Well, maybe I could have gotten a little flowery at some points, not relative to this,
Yeah.
but
I mean, I don't see it in your writing. I see your writing is very lean and to the point. Yeah.
Well, this was, but you know, I had some learning experiences there at the city desk, where someone said, "Is this really the word you want to use?" So
we're seeing your post editing work. It had been edited by the time we saw it.
Well, I will tell you, they were very generous. I don't remember any crisis of me being offended by anything being taken out or being manipulated or toned down. I think I was taught. I was just simply taught. I wasn't limited. I was educated.
Right.
So it's with no grievance that I talk about.
So it's more like mentoring.
Mentors.
I guess you got to do it to really understand it. But there's a bit of a fine line between, biased journalism and advocacy journalism, and that's where these adjectives come in. So if you're describing something as, this is a good thing, you can't say that. Right. But there's a ways to do it to get the point across that the publication is behind this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think that's what you were probably doing.
Yes.
One of the questions that I saw, Catherine, I just want to give Jane a chance to respond to it. We know what Brian is doing today. Brian's the executive editor of the Advance, and I keep thanking him for it because he does a fantastic job. But Jane, people want to know what your career. Did you continue to write? Did you continue in journalism? I mean, I know the answer, but people are wondering, what did you do in terms of your career?
I had a very checkered life, but no, I left the Advance. I went to work for Andrew Stein, who was an assemblyman in Manhattan. I left Andrew Stein. I became a waitress in a restaurant that I later bought with Eric Arts called Montezuma's Revenge in St. George.
We remember.
Okay.
Which we remember is a very good restaurant.
It was. And anyway, a a lot of things happened after that, but now I am in a family business with my brother, and we manage properties.
Do you
I
write
I
it
never
all?
worked with, Jane on journalism. She had left by the time I got there. The time I started working with Jane was to put parties for Mr. Diamond that she was catering.
Through Montezuma's?
No, this was later. This was
Oh, later
another.
in catering, later in catering.
That was another phase. But
Okay,
okay.
yeah, okay.
No, I only write letters of complaint now, but
Sure, they're great. So just to come, there's a follow-up question. Is what you were saying is that people could not leave to visit their families if they were not toilet trained?
no, I'm saying.
No,
that
but it was the barrier between.
It was
It was one of the barriers.
One of the barriers.
Mhm.
So, you're not talking about, it's not a toddler. You're talking about
Right.
taking home
An older person.
an older person. Being able
Mhm.
to manage something like that could be the difference between being able to go home, making the parents and the family feel that they could cope with the demands
Mhm.
of taking that person home,
Right.
for a visit.
And
Right.
you would think that someone being at a state school, this would be one of the skills that they would teach someone, yes? And of course, it was not something that was a focus until many later years after the deinstitutionalization. And some of it was simply because of staffing. They just didn't have staffing. And if you remember the old buildings, there'd be 40 to 50 people in a day room, and there were 5 toilets. Feature, 5
Right.
toilets.
So I'm going to group a couple of questions together because they're connected to each other. One that's coming up a couple of times here is about, did the story ever feel so big that it felt intimidating as people started to respond to it? I mean, one person asks if maybe you were the first viral local journalist
So
before the
yeah.
word was known, right? But as people responded to it and the story kind of got bigger, and then the Geraldo Rivera stuff came out and all of this cascade of energy around it, was that a little scary or was it exhilarating? How did you feel about that as the story grew and grew?
Frightened, because the responsibility grew and grew.
Yeah.
So it was scary. It got real.
Yeah.
There was a lot of attention, and it was a big responsibility.
Yeah.
And there was a real emotional component with it. You really felt like once it started to move, you felt kind of, wow, it's kind of this juggernaut. I mean, what are you going to do now?
Right.
What
The genie's out of the bottle, right?
What are you going to do with this now? Right. What comes next?
Yeah.
And there was also, there were people at certain points who asked questions that I didn't have answers for. I was not an expert. I was reporting what I saw. I was not an expert.
Right.
And so that was uncomfortable. I wanted to be an expert, but I didn't. It took a while.
Right.
I think,
Well,
I think it was to credit of the newspaper that when Jane did leave, the newspaper kept up with it and
It did.
wasn't intimidated. To be frank, the only time I ever felt overwhelmed in my career was when the towers collapsed on September 11th.
Mm.
That was a feeling I think most journalists in America just stood there like,
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah, I can imagine. There are also a couple of questions about your ability to interact with residents when you were doing the reporting. One, Jennifer Hampton talks about Bernard Carabello being interviewed by her daughter for a project where he talks about being smuggled out to talk to reporters, and other people have just asked about how you were able to interact with any of the residents. And could you talk a bit about that?
Well, I interacted with Bernard. I mean,
Bernard's amazing. Love Bernard.
Bernard, and that was a perfect example of Bernard suffered from cerebral palsy, not mental retardation, and he was really the spokesperson, the representative. I mean, he was on the inside, really on the inside, talking about it. But no, I did not have relationships or much interaction other than observing, and then of course talking to Bernard.
Well, and if you read your article, you can understand why that would be a particularly challenging thing to do, since many of the people became non-communicative as a result of being in the institution.
Yeah.
Right.
And there was not, it was, while we were inside talking and observing, we were certainly not at liberty to make ourselves too comfortable.
Mhm.
So it was not, I was not going to be able to interview people while I was there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
One of the things that you brought up when you spoke about Dr. Wilkins and Dr. Bronson and the social worker, that social worker was Elizabeth Lee. Somebody
Yes.
asked it in the
Yeah,
questions. It
I
was
asked.
Elizabeth Lee. That was you,
Okay.
Catherine? Okay.
Yeah,
It was
I
Elizabeth
thought
Lee.
it could be, but I could be wrong. So,
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it was
Okay.
Elizabeth Lee.
okay, that's great. Okay. So, oh, thank you. Tana is correcting me that I should not say people are non-communicative as long as they're conscious. What I meant perhaps was non-verbal. Was
Nonverbal.
actually more accurate, but that's what I
Yeah.
intended to convey. I'm sorry that I said it wrong. Eric Goldberg, who's a member of our Willowbrook Mile Committee, wants to turn this to what people can do as advocates. I had the really great pleasure of meeting with some of the SANIS people today, the Self-Advocate Association of New York State. It was great to talk with them. There's an amazing community of self-advocates out there. And do you see the possibility of alliances between the media and self-advocates? How can they work with the media to get the story out? Because there's, we need to keep the story front and center, not just historically, but there are things going on now that we need to make sure people understand. Do you have any advice for self-advocates?
Yeah, that's, I'm so glad to get that question. I've been following Willowbrook for all my career, but Diane has really lit that match again for me personally. And so we're going to do a whole project on Willowbrook around the mile.
Fantastic.
So I would encourage anybody to reach out to me directly. It's just my last name, LALINE@siadvance.com, or call me, 981-1234. And if I can't get back to you
So
immediately,
fast.
I get a million emails, but I will. And because we want to reach out into the community as much as possible when we do this project come fall.
And
That's great.
Jane, just for you to know, Bernard Carabello, if you didn't know it, is the founder
He's
of
the founder.
is the founder of the Self Advocates Alliance in New York State. So,
Diana, if I could just jump in here with one question of my own. You told a story that I think will resonate with people to make people understand that Willowbrook is still alive. You told a story about people who never knew they had a sibling, who are discovering it now after they die. Could you just talk about that for a minute? Because that told me this isn't over.
yeah, I mean,
Not over.
we had a number of individuals who lived in one of our group residences, and the obituary appeared in the advance. And we got a call from a sister, and she asked me, she said, this person, Anna, is the parents' name, same as my name. So my parents. So I said, well, what can I help you with? And as we go through the story, we find out that the mother was told that the daughter didn't live. She was a Down syndrome child. And the sister and brother never knew that the sister existed. The father really kept it from the family. And they then came to the residence. The sister had already passed, spent time with the people that lived there, listened to stories about her, saw pictures. We gave them some of the items that were hers. This was the times that we lived in, that people were separated, that there was this sense was that people who had Down syndrome wouldn't live past the age of 10 because of pneumonia and heart conditions, which was true if they brought up in an institution. But if they weren't subjected to the medically deprived conditions to be in an institution, they would live. And the little boy that I showed Brian the picture of, or Catherine seen, I think Jane has seen too, of Josh, he died at 70 years old, 65 years old. So people people, the information just wasn't shared. There was, I think shame is too strong of a word. I don't like the word shame, and I don't think families were ashamed. I think they were ill-informed by the medical community. I think they were ill-informed in terms of what should be the opportunities, what was the likelihood, what was the expectancy for this person, and certainly that piece that, well, they're people and they're entitled to live their lives, and so, you know, I'm not sure what aspect of it, Brian, it was, but it didn't happen once. It happened many times. It wasn't that it just happened with one sister. It happened with a brother. It happened actually, you know, with a couple of cousins. I mean, it's happened where families just had no knowledge whatsoever that this, and the young woman who passed, she passed it probably in her 30s. She was a very nice woman. I worked with her when she was 8 years old. And then she came to live in our group residence when we opened a very special place. And I knew her since she was a kid, and I was with her the day she died at Staten Island Hospital. And she had other family, but they never got to know her, right? That was a part that was missing from their lives, aside from what she was missing from her lives, that opportunity for her. Yeah. It's very, very sad. That's very, very sad, yeah, to me.
Well, and related to that, I just want to share that we're working on having in August an event on the campus, a live event for families and people connected to people who were at Willowbrook or who passed away at Willowbrook. And it's going to be a non-denominational, non-religious service of thanksgiving for those people and of remembrance of those people, because many families really have never had the opportunity to mourn their loss. And it's clearly a deep, deep trauma in this community. And we really need to come together and be thankful for our brothers and sisters and make sure that the families are okay, the people are okay. So that's, I get choked up when I think about it. That's one of the things that we're hoping to do. And I hope that the advance will help us to reach out and include as many people as would like to be part of that and invite them to come and take part in that event. So that's something. And then maybe to end on a slightly happier note, to know that the legacy of the work that you've done, and I'm just going to read a comment from Susan Calgettis, who says, "Thank you for keeping these stories alive. My son is 21, requires one-to-one care 24 hours a day. He's living with us and is out in the community. He has significant disabilities, a feeding tube, Down syndrome, autism, but he has family and nurses who allow him to live a life on his own terms. He's fully human. He has his own dreams, a life with dignity. May we always remember, may we never let this happen again, and let us know that it will absolutely happen if people forget." So thank you for not letting people forget, you know, for recording this, for talking about it with such human care. That's the thing that comes through to me, that it's a very human way of viewing the story. It's not cold and official, it's human. And that meant a lot. And it's meant a lot in many people's lives. So I think that's a really good place to sort of bring us to closure. There's also in the chat many discussions about the current crisis, that even in community care, people are not necessarily being funded the way that they need to be. The care is not necessarily available to them. That even if you're not isolated in an institution, you may be isolated in a home setting. And those resources are becoming fewer and farther between, as Diane has pointed out. And that's why our motto is never forget and never again. So I think it's important to remember that. There's some really great comments in the chat. I hope people will see those. And then we have
Will you
also,
be able,
oh, go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Catherine, will you
Yes.
be able to send just send the chat and Q&A
capture
off to Brian and Jane? You can capture that for them?
Sure. Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I can capture that, and we'll make sure that that's part of it. And of course, this
Okay.
recording will go up on our YouTube channel so folks can view it then. Okay, so I'm going to invite Nora to come back. Let me pin you, Nora. And to tell us about our next events. Oh, I think I may have just muted you. Maybe not. Sorry.
All right, no problem.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you all for attending tonight's event, and thank you for all our speakers. I would like to thank everyone who helped organizing this event and to ensure that everything runs smoothly. Don't forget our next event. It's scheduled for June 16th. It's gonna be, it's available right now actually on Eventbrite. I just put the link to the chat. The event is about Governor State School and the Willowbrook story. You will receive also an email with the registration information after this event. So in case you don't have a chance to take down the information. Also would like to remind you to please follow up on Eventbrite so you can be notified of any upcoming events. And we hope to see you all next month. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Jane. Thank you, Catherine, Nora. Thank you. Thank you so much for all you've done and all you're about to do, because I'm coming back at you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye-bye. Good night. Good night, folks.
Thank you so much. Good night. Hope to see you next month.